Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The September morning air felt unusually thick as I merged onto Lafayette Road, the main thoroughfare cutting through the Chickamauga battlefield. The dashboard clock read 6:42, and the sun hadn't quite breached the horizon, leaving the historical grounds draped in a gray pallor. I'd driven this route to work hundreds of times before, the familiar path taking me past weather-worn monuments and silent cannon that stood sentinel over the grounds where thousands had died during the Civil War. The battlefield had always given me an odd feeling, but I'd grown accustomed to it over the years. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering about the stories these grounds held, the last breaths, final thoughts, and unfulfilled promises of young men who never made it home. But that morning felt different. The air seemed to press against my car windows with an almost tangible weight. I'd taken to listening to true crime podcasts during my morning commute, but that day the voices discussing murder cases felt somehow disrespectful. I switched it off, leaving only the low hum of my Honda Civic's engine and the occasional crunch of tires over patches of gravel that had scattered onto the asphalt. As I approached the tower, a stark stone structure that rose from the battlefield like a broken tooth, the first truly strange thing happened. Through the pre-dawn gloom, my headlights caught something that made me ease off the accelerator. A white-tailed deer standing perfectly still in the center of the road. This wasn't entirely unusual. Deer were common in the area, and I'd had plenty of close calls over the years. But something about this one made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't grazing or looking around nervously like most deer do. Instead, it stood completely motionless, its head turned toward the dense woods that bordered the road. I tapped my horn lightly, expecting the deer to bolt like they always do. Nothing. It remained frozen as if carved from stone. Frustration began to override my initial unease. I was already cutting it close for my shift at the hospital, and I didn't have time for this. I revved my engine, the sound echoing off the surrounding trees. Still nothing. I revved again, louder this time. The deer's ear twitched, but otherwise it might as well have been stuffed and mounted. On the third rev, something changed in the air, like the pressure dropping before a storm. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I revved the engine a fourth time. What happened next defied everything I knew about animal behavior, and frankly, physics. The deer's front legs left the ground, but not in a leap. Slowly, deliberately, it rose until it was standing on its hind legs like a person. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, the wrongness of its posture, the impossible angle of its spine. Then it turned its head. Not like a deer checking its surroundings, but a complete 180-degree rotation that no living creature should be capable of. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I realized they weren't the soft brown eyes of a deer at all. They were milky white like cataracts, but with pinprick black pupils that seemed to bore into my soul. My foot slammed onto the gas pedal before my brain could fully process what I was seeing. The engine roared as I threw the car into reverse, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The rear-view camera showed nothing but empty road behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following. I backed up until I reached a wide spot in the road where I could turn around, my heart thundering against my ribs. As I spun the wheel, my headlights swept across the spot where the deer had been standing. The road was empty now, but something dark glistened on the asphalt, something that looked unsettlingly like hoofprints, but deeper than any deer should have made. I called out sick from work that day, spending hours researching the history of Chickamauga battlefield. I'd known the basics, that it was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War with over 34,000 casualties. But I found myself diving deeper into personal accounts and local legends. Stories of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and the famous Green Eyes ghost that was said to still patrol the battlefield at night. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There had to be a logical explanation for what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I'd dozed off for a split second at the wheel. But deep down I knew what I'd seen was real. And something else nagged at me, a feeling that this wasn't over. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to tell my girlfriend Maria, about what had happened. She listened with the kind of skeptical patience I'd expected, her dark eyes studying my face as I stumbled through the story. To my surprise, instead of telling me I was crazy, she suggested we go back. "If something weird is really happening out there, don't you want to know what it is?" she asked, her psychology degree showing. "Besides, you have to drive that route to work anyway. Better to face it head on than let it mess with your head." She had a point, but that didn't make it any easier when we pulled onto the battlefield grounds just after sunset, 4 days after my initial encounter. The park was technically closed, but the roads remained open, and there was something comforting about having another person in the car, even if that person was currently engaged in a heated phone argument with her mother about Thanksgiving plans. The familiar landmarks looked different in the growing darkness. Shadows seemed to move between the trees, and every monument looked like a crouching figure, until we got close enough for the headlights to reveal its true nature. I pulled over near the tower, killing the engine but leaving the headlights on. Maria was still on the phone, her voice rising with frustration as she argued about bringing her new boyfriend to the family gathering. I needed some air and some nicotine to calm my nerves. "I'm gonna step out for a smoke," I whispered, holding up my pack of Camels. She nodded absently, deep in her conversation. The moment I closed the car door, I was struck by the absolute silence of the place. No crickets, no distant traffic, not even the rustle of wind through the trees. The only sound was the muffled voice of Maria in the car, and even that seemed somehow wrong, like it was being swallowed by the darkness. I lit my cigarette with trembling hands, the flame of my lighter briefly illuminating the area around me. That's when I heard it, the snap of a twig to my left followed by another to my right. My heart rate doubled instantly as I remembered stories about predators circling their prey. I squinted into the darkness and my blood ran cold. There, at the edge of the headlights' reach, were eyes, not just one pair but several, glowing with that same milky white sheen I'd seen on the deer. A low growl rolled across the ground, so deep it seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. I didn't waste time trying to make out what I was looking at. I dropped my cigarette and bolted for the car door, but something was wrong. The distance seemed to stretch, the car getting further away with each step, even though I knew that was impossible. Behind me, the growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Then I felt it, warm breath on the back of my neck, carrying the unmistakable smell of decay. My legs went weak, but somehow I kept running. I reached for the door handle just as something brushed against my back, something that felt like fingers but too long, too cold. I practically dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. Maria finally ended her call, looking at me with concern. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before I could answer, something large moved in front of the headlights just for a second, but long enough to see that it walked on 2 legs, was far too tall to be human, and had the head of a deer with those horrible milky eyes. I gunned the engine and peeled out of there, tires throwing gravel as we fishtailed onto the main road. Maria gripped the dashboard, demanding to know what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. I didn't slow down until we were miles away from the battlefield, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. When I finally pulled over at a well-lit gas station, I told her everything, both encounters, the eyes, the growling, the thing that had almost caught me. To her credit, she didn't dismiss my story outright. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started researching. "There are other reports," she said after a few minutes. "Not exactly like yours, but similar. People seeing animals acting strangely, feeling watched, hearing growls. Some people think the battlefield is Thin Spot, a place where the barrier between our world and whatever's on the other side isn't as strong." I nodded, but I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about all the times I'd driven through the battlefield at night, completely unaware of what was watching from the shadows. I was thinking about the thousands of violent deaths that had occurred there, and whether something about all that pain and suffering had left a mark on the land itself. That was 3 weeks ago. I've since changed my route to work, adding 20 minutes to my commute to avoid the battlefield entirely. I've tried to convince myself that there must be a rational explanation for what happened, but deep down I know better. Sometimes at night, I still dream about those milky white eyes and wake up with the phantom sensation of breath on the back of my neck. Maria's been doing more research into the history of Chickamauga, And what she's found is disturbing. The land was sacred to the Cherokee long before the Civil War, and they had their own stories about spirits that guarded the area. The battle itself was uncommonly brutal, with men fighting hand to hand in such darkness that they couldn't tell friend from foe. Many bodies were never recovered. I've thought about reporting what happened, but who would believe me? And more importantly, what good would it do? The battlefield has its secrets, and maybe they're better left undisturbed. All I know is that something out there wanted to send me a message that night. A warning that some places belong to the dead, and the living would do well to remember that. These days, when I drive past the battlefield entrance on my new route to work, I don't look toward the tower, but sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of something standing there watching. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can see it rise up on its hind legs. The monotonous hum of tires on asphalt had become a lullaby to Jake Harmon over his 15 years as a long-haul trucker. But tonight that familiar sound was more of a siren call, luring him toward the dangerous shoals of exhaustion. He'd been on the road for nearly 9 hours, pushing the legal limit of his driving time. The clock on his dashboard read 11:47 p.m., its red digits a stark contrast to the inky blackness beyond his windshield. Jake's eyes felt like they were lined with sandpaper every time he blinked. He'd downed his third cup of gas station coffee 2 hours ago, but the caffeine buzz had long since faded, leaving him jittery and on edge. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white, a futile attempt to physically fight off the fatigue creeping into his bones. The cab of his Peterbilt 579 was a cocoon of soft amber light from the instrument panel, but beyond the reach of his headlights, the world had been swallowed by an impenetrable darkness. Jake found himself leaning forward, straining to see anything beyond the cone of light illuminating the road ahead. The night seemed to press in on all sides as if trying to crush the life out of his 10-ton machine. He'd driven this stretch of I-40 through eastern New Mexico countless times, but tonight it felt different, alien, hostile even. The usual landmarks were cloaked in shadow, and even the familiar silhouettes of mesas and buttes rising against the starry sky seemed warped and menacing. Jake shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs. He knew he was in no condition to keep driving. Few things were as dangerous on the road as a tired trucker behind the wheel, and he'd seen the aftermath of too many accidents caused by dozed-off drivers to risk it. Just as he was considering pulling onto the shoulder to catch a few hours of shut-eye, a pinprick of light appeared on the horizon. Jake sat up straighter, hope surging through him. As his truck rumbled down the empty highway, the light grew steadily closer and brighter. Soon, it resolved into the welcoming glow of a service station. Thank God, Jake muttered, flicking on his turn signal even though there wasn't another vehicle in sight. He eased off the accelerator, feeling the weight of the fully loaded trailer behind him as the big rig slowed. The exit ramp curved gently, leading him toward the oasis of light. As Jake pulled into the service station, he was surprised by the amount of activity. It was nearly midnight, but the forecourt bustled with other truckers. Most were burly men in high-visibility jackets, sipping from paper cups and munching on greasy food from the station's deli. A wave of relief washed over Jake. There was safety in numbers, and the thought of spending the night here among his own kind was infinitely preferable to dozing fitfully in his cab on the side of a desolate highway. He carefully maneuvered his rig into one of the oversized parking spots designated for semis, cut the engine, and climbed down from the cab. The cool night air hit him like a slap to the face, instantly refreshing. Jake stretched, hearing his spine pop in several places. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with a crisp desert air tinged with the scent of diesel and fried food. As Jake walked toward the brightly lit building, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The fluorescent light seemed harsher than usual, casting stark shadows that danced and shifted in ways that made him uneasy. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes drawn to the line where the station's lights ended and the vast darkness of the desert began. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw movement in those shadows, something large and fast darting just out of sight. Jake blinked hard and looked again. Nothing but stillness and the soft whisper of wind through scrub brush. He shook his head, chalking it up to fatigue and an overactive imagination. Still, as he reached for the door handle, Jake couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was being watched. The harsh fluorescent lighting inside the service station made Jake squint as he entered. The smell of stale coffee and day-old hot dogs assaulted his nostrils, a greasy miasma that clung to everything. Despite the late hour, a surprising number of people milled about, mostly fellow truckers killing time or grabbing a quick bite before hitting the road again. Jake's stomach growled, reminding him that his last meal had been a hastily unwrapped protein bar somewhere in Texas. He made his way to the food counter, joining the short line of bleary-eyed drivers waiting to place their orders. As he waited, Jake found himself studying the other occupants of the service station. There was something almost surreal about the scene, a pocket of bustling humanity in the midst of the vast empty desert night. A heavy-set man with a salt and pepper beard was hunched over a table, shoveling forkfuls of scrambled eggs into his mouth while poring over a dog-eared road atlas. Near the windows, two younger drivers were engaged in an animated conversation, their voices a low murmur beneath the hum of the overhead lights and the soft country music playing from tinny speakers. But it was the woman behind the counter who caught Jake's attention. She was older, probably in her mid-60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite the late hour and what must have been a long shift, she greeted each customer with a warm smile and easy conversation. When it was Jake's turn to order, he approached the counter with a tired smile. "Evening, ma'am. First time at this service station. What's good here?" The woman, her name tag read Betty, smiled back. "Welcome, honey. Can't go wrong with our loaded fries. Throw some chili and cheese on there. It'll stick to your ribs." Jake nodded gratefully. "Sounds perfect. I'll take that and a large coffee, black." As Betty busied herself preparing his order, Jake made small talk. Quite the crowd for this time of night. Betty glanced up, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, we get all sorts passing through here. Truckers, tourists, folks running from something or chasing after it. This place is a bit of a crossroads, if you know what I mean." There was something in her tone that made Jake pause. "Crossroads? How do you mean?" Betty's hand stilled for a moment, and when she looked up at Jake, the warmth had faded from her eyes. "Just that. Well, strange things tend to happen around here, especially at night. You staying over?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, parked around back. Hit my drive time limit and figured this was as good a place as any to catch some shut-eye." The smile dropped from Betty's face entirely. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Listen to me carefully, young man. If you're staying the night, make sure you park under the hard lights. And whatever you do, don't wander out into the dark. Not here." A chill ran down Jake's spine. "What do you mean? What's out there?" Betty glanced around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "I've worked here for 30 years, seen things you wouldn't believe. Things that ain't natural, just trust me on this. Stay in the light." Before Jake could press her further, Betty straightened up, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Here you go, hun. Enjoy your meal." She pushed a tray toward him, laden with a steaming plate of fries smothered in chili and cheese, along with a large paper cup of coffee. Jake took the tray, his appetite suddenly diminished. He found an empty booth in the corner and sat down, his mind reeling. Part of him wanted to dismiss Betty's warning as the ramblings of a superstitious old woman who'd spent too many nights alone in this desolate place. But there was a conviction in her eyes, a genuine fear that he couldn't shake. As he picked at his food, Jake found his gaze drawn to the windows. The light from the service station seemed to create a bubble of safety, beyond which lay an ocean of impenetrable darkness. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching and waiting. A movement caught his eye, a fleeting shadow that seemed to dart just at the edge of the light. Jake blinked and it was gone. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself it was just fatigue playing tricks on him. But as he stared out into the night, he couldn't help but wonder, what secrets did this lonely stretch of highway hold? And more importantly, would he live to see the morning and tell about them? Jake's fries had long since gone cold, congealing into an unappetizing mass on his plate. He'd managed to choke down about half before giving up, his appetite soured by an inexplicable sense of dread that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The coffee, at least, was doing its job. He felt more alert now, though not necessarily in a good way. Every shadow, every unexplained noise had him on edge. He glanced at his watch. 1:17 a.m. The initial flurry of activity in the service station had died down, with most of the other truckers having either hit the road again or retreated to their cabs for the night. Only a handful of people remained inside, a couple of bleary-eyed travelers nursing cups of coffee, and Betty behind the counter methodically wiping down surfaces with a damp cloth. Jake stood, his joints popping in protest. He gathered his trash and made his way to the garbage can, then approached the counter. Betty looked up as he neared, a wary expression crossing her face. "Everything all right with your meal, hon?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was asking about more than just the food. Jake nodded. "Yeah, it was fine, thanks." He hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Listen, about what you said earlier, about strange things happening around here. What did you mean exactly?" Betty's eyes darted around the nearly empty service station before settling back on Jake. She sighed heavily, seeming to deflate a little. "I probably shouldn't say anything. Management doesn't like us talking about it. Bad for business, you know." But she trailed off, chewing her lower lip. "But," Jake prompted gently. Betty's voice dropped to a whisper. "But I've seen things, heard things, things that don't make no sense." She shuddered. "About 5 years back, a trucker, nice fella, used to stop in regular. He parked out back one night in the dark part of the lot. Next morning, his rig was still there, but he wasn't. We found pieces of him, like something had—" She swallowed hard. "Like something had torn him apart." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "Jesus, what? I mean, was it some kind of animal attack?" Betty shook her head emphatically. "No animal I've ever seen could do what was done to that poor man. And that ain't the half of it. Folks report seeing things out there in the dark. Eyes watching them. Voices calling their names. Some say they've seen something. Something big and fast and—" She trailed off, her eyes glazing over as if lost in a terrifying memory. Jake waited, but Betty seemed disinclined to continue. He cleared his throat. "Have you ever seen anything yourself?" The question seemed to snap Betty out of her reverie. She blinked rapidly, focusing on Jake once more. "Once," she said softly. "Just once. It was late, like now. I was taking out the trash to the dumpster out back. I heard a sound, like something big moving through the brush. When I turned to look," she shuddered. "Two eyes glowing red in the dark. And a shape. God, it was huge. Didn't look like any animal I've ever seen. It was there for just a second, then it was gone." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to dismiss Betty's story as the product of an overactive imagination, but the genuine fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. "Why?" he started, then had to clear his throat. "Why haven't you reported this? To the police or—" Betty let out a bitter laugh.
"Oh, honey."
"You think we haven't tried? Cops came out a few times, but they never found nothing. Said it was probably just coyotes or mountain lions. After a while, they stopped coming. And corporate—" She shook her head. "They don't want to hear about it. Say it's bad for business. They've even tried to transfer me a couple times, but—" She gestured around the empty service station. "This place is my home. I can't just leave it." Jake nodded slowly, processing everything he'd heard. Part of him still wanted to rationalize it all away. Stress, isolation, and the unforgiving desert playing tricks on people's minds. But another part, a primal part buried deep in his lizard brain, was screaming at him to get back in his truck and drive as far and as fast as he could. I should probably get some sleep," Jake said, his voice sounding strangely distant to his own ears. Betty nodded. "You do that, hun. Just remember what I said. Stay in the light." As Jake turned to leave, Betty called out to him one last time. "And whatever you do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you hear anything at all, don't answer. Don't even look. Just stay in your cab and wait for dawn." Jake nodded numbly and made his way to the exit. As he pushed open the door, the cool night air hit him like a physical force. He paused on the threshold, looking out into the darkness. The lights of the service station created a small island of illumination, beyond which lay a sea of impenetrable blackness. For a moment, Jake could have sworn he saw movement out there, a large shape slinking just beyond the reach of the light. He blinked and it was gone. Probably just his imagination, fueled by Betty's stories and too much caffeine. Still, as he made his way back to his truck, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He climbed into the cab, locking the doors behind him. As he settled into the sleeper berth, Jake found himself grateful for the larger-than-average size of his cabin. It felt like a fortress, a safe haven against whatever might be lurking out there in the dark. But as he lay there, staring up at the ceiling, Jake couldn't help but wonder, was he truly safe? Or had he unwittingly stumbled into a nightmare from which there might be no waking? Sleep did not come easily to Jake. He tossed and turned in his berth, Betty's warnings echoing in his mind. Every creak of the truck's frame, every whisper of wind outside had him starting awake, his heart pounding. When he did manage to drift off, his dreams were filled with shapeless horrors lurking just out of sight, red eyes gleaming in the dark. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when a loud bang jolted him awake. Jake sat bolt upright, his forehead nearly colliding with the low ceiling of the sleeper berth. He froze, straining his ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. Then it came again, a distinct bang, as if something had struck the side of his truck. Jake's mouth went dry, his palms suddenly slick with sweat. He reached for the curtain separating the sleeper berth from the cab, his hand trembling. Before he could pull it aside, a scrabbling sound came from the passenger side of the truck. It was like nothing Jake had ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. The sound of claws or nails dragging along metal, accompanied by a low, guttural growling that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He wanted desperately to look, to confront whatever was out there. But Betty's final warning rang in his ears. If you hear anything, anything at all, don't answer. Don't even look. The scrabbling intensified, moving along the side of the truck toward the back. Then silence. Jake held his breath, straining to hear any sound of movement. The silence stretched on, broken only by the hammering of his own heart. Just as Jake began to think that perhaps it had all been a product of his overwrought imagination, a new sound broke the silence. A voice, low and gravelly, seemed to come from just outside his driver's side window. "Jake," it rasped, barely above a whisper. "Jake, come out and play." A chill ran down Jake's spine. How did it know his name? He hadn't told anyone at the service station his full name, had he? The voice came again, louder this time. "Jake! Don't make me come in there and get you." Every instinct screamed at Jake to stay put, to keep quiet and wait for dawn. But curiosity and fear warred within him. He had to know what was out there. With trembling hands, Jake reached for the curtain again. He hesitated for a moment, then steeled himself and yanked it aside. At first, he saw nothing but darkness beyond the window. Then slowly, a shape began to coalesce in the gloom. 2 pinpricks of red light appeared, growing larger as if drawing nearer. Jake realized with horror that he was looking at a pair of eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light. As the shape drew closer, Jake could make out more details. It was vaguely humanoid, but much larger than any man he'd ever seen. Its body was covered in matted, thick fur, and its face, Jake's mind recoiled from what he saw. It was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth bared in a feral grin. The creature pressed its face against the window, its hot breath fogging the glass. Jake sat frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. The monster's eyes bored into him, filled with a predatory intelligence that chilled him to his very core. Then, without warning, it reared back and slammed its massive fist against the window. The glass spiderwebbed but held. Jake snapped out of his paralysis, scrambling backward into the sleeper berth. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. As Jake pressed the phone to his ear, praying for someone to answer, the creature outside let out a bone-chilling howl. It was a sound of pure hunger and rage, promising violence and death. Jake knew with a certainty that transcended mere fear that if that thing got into his truck, he wouldn't live to see the morning. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each unanswered ring sent a fresh wave of panic through Jake. Outside, the creature continued its assault on the truck, the impacts growing stronger with each blow. The spiderweb of cracks in the driver's side window was spreading, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the glass gave way. Finally, on the 5th ring, a voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Jake's words came out in a panicked rush. Please, you have to help me. I'm at the service station off I-40, mile marker 181. There's something out here, something trying to get into my truck. It's not human, it's... A particularly violent impact cut him off. The driver's side window finally shattered, sending a shower of glass into the cab. Jake scrambled further back into the sleeper berth, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Sir? Sir, are you still there? The dispatcher's voice seemed to come from a great distance. What's your name? Can you describe what's happening? Jake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Through the shattered window, a massive, fur-covered arm was reaching into the cab, razor-sharp claws raking the air mere inches from where Jake huddled. The creature let out another bone-chilling howl, and Jake felt something warm running down his leg. With a start, he realized he had wet himself in terror. Please, he whimpered into the phone. Please hurry. It's going to kill me. The arm withdrew, and for a moment, Jake dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the thing had given up. But then he heard movement on the roof of the cab. The entire truck shook as something massive crawled across it. Sir, I've dispatched units to your location, the 911 operator was saying. They should be there in about 15 minutes. Can you get to a more secure location? Jake wanted to laugh hysterically. 15 minutes? He'd be dead in 5. There is no secure location, he whispered. It's everywhere. It's... His words were cut off as the roof of the cab suddenly caved in with a thunderous crash. Jake looked up to see the creature's face peering down at him through the new opening, its red eyes gleaming with malevolent hunger. Found you, it growled, its voice a horrifying mix of human speech and animalistic snarls. Jake screamed, dropping the phone. He pressed himself against the back wall of the sleeper berth, knowing there was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The creature's massive arm shot through the opening, claws extended. Jake felt a searing pain as those claws raked across his chest, tearing through his shirt and into his flesh. Warm blood began to soak the front of his shirt. In that moment, as he stared death in the face, Jake's mind flashed back to Betty's warning. Stay in the light, she had said. The light. With a surge of desperate energy, Jake lunged forward, pushing past the pain. He scrambled into the cab, his hand frantically searching for the switch to the external floodlights he'd had installed for nighttime deliveries. The creature, sensing its prey was about to escape, let out a roar of fury. It began to force its way through the opening in the roof, its massive body barely fitting through the gap. Jake's fingers finally found the switch. With a silent prayer, he flipped it on. Brilliant white light flooded the area around the truck. The effect on the creature was immediate and shocking. It recoiled as if struck, letting out a shriek of pain that was almost human in its anguish. Jake watched in disbelief as the thing retreated, scrambling off the roof of his truck and disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the floodlights. For several long moments, Jake sat there, his chest heaving, blood still seeping from the gashes left by the creature's claws. He strained his ears, listening for any sign that it might return. But there was nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the service station's generators. Slowly, painfully, Jake retrieved his fallen phone. The 911 operator was still on the line, her voice frantic. Sir, are you there? What's happening? Jake took a shuddering breath. It's gone, for now. But please tell them to hurry. I don't know if the lights will keep it away for long. As if in response to his words, a long, mournful howl rose from somewhere in the darkness beyond the service station. It was filled with frustration and hunger, and promise. A promise that this night was far from over. Jake huddled in his ruined cab, the floodlights his only protection against the horrors that lurked in the dark. And he prayed for the first time in years that he would live to see the dawn. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Jake remained huddled in his cab, one hand pressed against the bleeding gashes on his chest, the other clutching his phone like a lifeline. The 911 operator had stayed on the line with him, her calm voice a tenuous thread connecting him to sanity and safety. But as the adrenaline began to ebb, the pain from his injuries intensified. Each breath sent a fresh wave of agony through his body. Jake knew he needed medical attention, but the thought of leaving the relative safety of his truck and its protective circle of light filled him with paralyzing dread. A movement caught his eye and Jake's heart leapt into his throat. But it was only a fellow trucker. emerging from his own rig parked a few spaces away. The man looked around blearily, clearly having just woken up. His eyes widened as he took in the state of Jake's truck, the shattered window, the caved-in roof. "Hey," the man called out, starting to approach. "You okay in there? What the hell happened?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, to warn the man to get back to his own truck to stay in the light. But before he could utter a word, a dark shape materialized out of the shadows behind the unsuspecting trucker. "No," Jake screamed. "Behind you!" The trucker began to turn, but it was too late. A massive clawed hand closed around his throat, lifting him off his feet. The man's scream was cut off into a gurgling choke as the creature dragged him back into the darkness. Jake watched in horror, helpless to intervene. The sounds that followed, the wet tearing of flesh, the cracking of bones, the trucker's agonized moans fading into silence, would haunt him for the rest of his days. "What's happening?" The 911 operator's voice came through the phone, sharp with concern. "Sir, I heard screaming. Are you all right?" Jake couldn't find the words to describe the horror he'd just witnessed. It got someone else," he managed to choke out. "Oh God, it killed him." "Where are the police?" "Please, you have to send someone. Units are en route," the operator assured him. "They should be there any minute now. Just stay calm and—" Her words were drowned out by a cacophony of howls that rose from the darkness surrounding the service station. It wasn't just one voice, but many, a chorus of inhuman cries that sent shivers down Jake's spine. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the howling stopped. In the eerie silence that followed, Jake became aware of a new sound. Voices, human voices, calling out from the darkness. "Help us," they cried. "Please, someone help us!" Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized one of the voices. It was Betty, the kindly woman from the service station counter. "Jake," her voice called out, filled with terror and pain. "Jake, honey, please help me." "It's got me!" "Oh God, it hurts." Every instinct in Jake's body screamed at him to go to her aid, but a small rational part of his mind held him back. He'd seen Betty less than an hour ago, safe behind the counter in the service station. There was no way she could be out there in the dark. "It's not real," he whispered to himself, squeezing his eyes shut. "It's not real. It's just trying to lure you out." But the cries continued, growing more desperate and agonized. Jake clamped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sound. Tears streamed down his face as he fought against the urge to rush out into the darkness. "They're coming for you, Jake," a new voice whispered, seeming to come from right outside his shattered window. It was low and guttural, a twisted parody of human speech. "Your lights can't protect you forever. When they fail, we'll be waiting. And then the real fun begins." A chorus of inhuman laughter rose from the darkness, a sound of such malevolent glee that it shook Jake to his very core. He curled into a tight ball on the floor of his cab, squeezing his eyes shut and praying for this nightmare to end. In the distance, barely audible over the mocking laughter and agonized screams, Jake thought he heard the wail of approaching sirens. But would help arrive in time, or would the encroaching darkness claim him before dawn could break? As the night wore on, Jake Harmon clung to his sanity by the thinnest of threads, trapped in a hell he never could have imagined when he'd pulled into this lonely service station just a few hours ago. The sirens grew louder, their urgent wails cutting through the cacophony of inhuman voices that had tormented Jake. For what felt like an eternity, he uncurled himself from the fetal position he'd been in, wincing at the pain that lanced through his body. The gashes on his chest had mostly stopped bleeding, but they throbbed with every heartbeat. Through the shattered window of his cab, Jake could see the first hints of pre-dawn light tinging the eastern sky. The long night was finally coming to an end, but would help arrive in time. The sound of squealing tires and slamming car doors jolted Jake fully alert. Flashlight beams cut through the dim light sweeping across the parking lot. "Police, is anyone there?" A voice called out. Jake's heart leapt. He fumbled for the door handle, his fingers clumsy with exhaustion and lingering terror. As he pushed the door open, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He realized he'd lost more blood than he'd thought. "Here," he croaked, his voice hoarse from hours of screaming and crying. "I'm here. Please help." Two police officers approached cautiously, their flashlights trained on Jake. He saw their eyes widen as they took in the state of his truck and his blood-soaked shirt. "Jesus Christ," one of them muttered. What the hell happened here? Jake opened his mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could he possibly describe the horrors he'd witnessed? Who would believe him?
Sir, are you Jake Harmon?
The other officer asked. When Jake nodded weakly, she continued, We got a 911 call about a disturbance here. Can you tell us what happened? Before Jake could respond, a commotion from the direction of the service station drew their attention. More flashlight beams appeared, accompanied by urgent voices. We've got a body over here, someone shouted. Looks like it's been... Oh, God. The officer speaking to Jake keyed her radio. Dispatch, we're going to need additional units and a crime scene team out here. And get an ambulance rolling. We've got at least one injured civilian. As if summoned by her words, the wail of an approaching ambulance joined the chaos of flashing lights and urgent voices. The sky was growing steadily lighter, the encroaching dawn seeming to push back the shadows that had held such terror during the night. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. He was safe. It was over. But even as that thought crossed his mind, he became aware of a low, rumbling growl coming from somewhere behind his truck. He turned, his heart in his throat, to see a pair of glowing red eyes watching him from the edge of the light. The creature was still there, held at bay by the growing daylight but unwilling to fully retreat. There! Jake shouted, pointing. It's right there. Can't you see it? The officers spun, their hands going to their weapons. But by the time they looked where Jake was pointing, the eyes had vanished. All that remained was an empty stretch of scrubland, already being illuminated by the first true rays of sunlight. Sir, there's nothing there, one of the officers said gently. Let's get you looked at by the paramedics. You've lost a lot of blood. As they led him toward the waiting ambulance, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced back over his shoulder, scanning the brightening landscape for any sign of the creature that had terrorized him through the night. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a large, dark shape slinking away into a culvert at the edge of the property. But then he blinked and it was gone. Had it all been real? Or had fear, isolation, and blood loss caused him to hallucinate the entire ordeal? As the paramedics began to treat his wounds, Jake found he no longer knew what to believe. But one thing was certain. He would never look at the dark the same way again. And he knew with a bone-deep certainty that he would never again stop at the lonely service station at mile marker 181. 1 month later, Jake Harmon sat in his therapist's office, his fingers idly tracing the still healing scars on his chest. Dr. Eileen Chen watched him with a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. How have the nightmares been this week, Jake? She asked gently. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. It had started to go gray at the temples in the weeks since that terrible night. Better, I think. I mean, I still have them every night, but I don't wake up screaming anymore. That's progress, right? Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. It is. Trauma takes time to process, Jake. What you experienced, well, it's not something anyone could just shake off. Jake let out a bitter laugh. What I experienced? You mean what I think I experienced, right? That's what everyone keeps telling me. That it was all in my head. Mass hysteria or hallucinations from blood loss or whatever. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. What do you believe happened that night, Jake? Jake was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the bustling city beyond. How could he explain the inexplicable? The memory of those glowing red eyes, the inhuman howls, the terror that had gripped him so completely. It all felt so real even now. I know what I saw, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I know what I heard. It wasn't human, Doc. Whatever was out there that night, it was something else. Something that shouldn't exist in our world. Dr. Chen nodded, her face neutral. And how does holding on to that belief affect you, Jake? Does it help you move forward, or does it keep you trapped in that night? Jake considered the question. I don't know, he admitted. Sometimes I think I'm crazy, that maybe everyone's right and it was all just some vivid hallucination. But then I look at these scars, he gestured to his chest, and I know it was real. The police report mentioned another victim, Dr. Chen prompted gently. A trucker who was found, deceased at the scene. Have you had any thoughts about that? Jake squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of the man being dragged into the darkness, the horrible sounds that had followed. I see his face every night in my dreams, he whispered. I keep thinking, if I had warned him sooner or if I had somehow helped him. Jake, Dr. Chen interrupted softly, you can't blame yourself for that man's death. From everything you've told me, there was nothing you could have done. Jake nodded, but the guilt still gnawed at him. He cleared his throat. I tried to go back, to the service station. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. Oh, when was this? Last week, Jake said. I don't know what I thought. That maybe seeing it in the daylight would help me process everything. That I'd find some evidence of what happened, something to prove I wasn't crazy. And did you find what you were looking for? Jake shook his head. I couldn't even find the place. I drove up and down that stretch of I-40 for hours. There was nothing there. No service station, no mile marker 181. It was just gone. Dr. Chen was silent for a moment, her pen poised over her notepad. How does that make you feel, Jake? Jake laughed, a hollow sound devoid of humor. How does it make me feel? It makes me feel like I'm losing my mind, Doc. Like maybe everyone's right and it was all just some elaborate delusion. But you don't really believe that, do you? Dr. Chen asked softly. Jake met her eyes. No, he said firmly. No, I don't. I know what happened to me was real. I don't know how to live with it. How do I go back to my normal life after experiencing something like that? Dr. Chen set her notepad aside and leaned forward. Jake, trauma changes us. Whether it's a car accident, a violent crime, or something less easily defined. The goal isn't to go back to who you were before. It's to find a way to move forward, to integrate this experience into your life in a way that doesn't cripple you. Jake nodded slowly. And how do I do that? We work on it together, Dr. Chen said with a small smile. It's a process, Jake. It takes time. But I believe you can get there. As Jake left the office that day, he felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since that terrible night. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but he was determined to reclaim his life. But as he walked to his car, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He scanned the busy street, half expecting to see glowing red eyes peering at him from some shadowy alley. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual bustle of city life. Jake shook his head, trying to clear away the paranoia. As he climbed into his car, his hand brushed against something in his pocket. Frowning, he pulled it out. It was a matchbook emblazoned with the logo of the service station at mile marker 181. Jake stared at it, his mouth going dry. He knew with absolute certainty that he hadn't had this before. Somehow it had appeared in his pocket during his therapy session. With trembling hands, Jake opened the matchbook. Inside, scrawled in spidery handwriting, was a message. We're still waiting, Jake. The dark is patient. We'll meet again. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He looked up, scanning the street once more. For just a moment, he thought he saw a familiar figure standing on the corner. An older woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Betty? But when he blinked, she was gone. Jake sat in his car, the matchbook clutched in his shaking hand as the reality of his situation crashed over him. It wasn't over. Maybe it would never be over. The creatures of the night that had tormented him at mile marker 181 weren't content to stay in that lonely stretch of desert. They had followed him here to the heart of the city, and they were patient. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Jake Harmon realized a chilling truth. His long night of terror had only just begun. I was 15 years old when it happened. The memory of that night still sends shivers down my spine. Even now, as I recount the events, we lived in the northwest region of Pennsylvania, in a heavily wooded area that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Our house, an old two-story farmhouse that had been in my family for generations, stood isolated amidst a sea of towering pines and ancient oaks. My grandparents owned acres upon acres of land, including the dense woods that surrounded our home. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the closest town was a good hour's drive. It was the kind of place where silence reigned supreme, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustling of leaves in the wind. Growing up in such isolation, I had learned to appreciate the solitude and the raw beauty of nature. but I had also learned to respect its power and unpredictability. My grandfather, a stern man with weathered hands and a face etched with lines of hard-won wisdom, had always warned me about the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the forest. Nature ain't always kind, he'd say, his eyes fixed on the tree line as if he could see something I couldn't. You gotta be prepared for anything out there. At the time, I thought he was just being overprotective. After all, I had spent countless nights camping in those woods, building fires and listening to the nocturnal symphony of crickets and owls. I loved the outdoors and considered myself something of an expert on our little corner of the wilderness. But there was one chore I always dreaded: locking up the chicken coop at dusk. We had a small flock of chickens that provided us with fresh eggs and the occasional Sunday roast. However, the coop needed to be secured every evening to protect our feathered friends from predators like coyotes and raccoons. Normally, this was my grandfather's job, but he had recently suffered a stroke, leaving him bedridden and unable to perform even the simplest tasks. The responsibility of securing the coop had fallen to me, and despite my familiarity with the woods, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me each time I ventured out as the sun began to set. Little did I know that on one fateful summer night, my grandfather's warnings would prove to be more than just the cautious words of an old man. The horrors that awaited me in those woods would change my perception of reality forever. The day had started like any other. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, turning our tin-roofed house into an oven. I spent most of the morning helping my grandmother tend to my grandfather, changing his sheets, helping him with his exercises, and making sure he took his medication on time. By afternoon, I was itching to get outside. The suffocating heat inside the house was becoming unbearable, and the cool shade of the forest beckoned. I decided to set up my tent for a night of camping, something I hadn't done since before my grandfather's stroke. "You be careful out there," my grandmother cautioned as I headed out the door, her brow furrowed with worry. "And don't forget to lock up the chickens before it gets dark." I nodded, assuring her that I'd be fine. Our family dog, Molly, a pit bull we had rescued from an abusive home, trotted along beside me. Despite her breed's unfair reputation, Molly was a sweetheart, loyal to a fault and always eager to accompany me on my outdoor adventures. As I set up my tent in a small clearing about 100 yards from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods seemed quieter than usual. The typical chattering of squirrels and singing of birds was noticeably absent. Even Molly seemed on edge, her ears perked up and her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. I tried to brush off the unease, chalking it up to paranoia brought on by too many nights cooped up inside. But as the afternoon wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, the feeling only intensified. By the time dusk began to fall, I had a roaring campfire going, and my tent was set up snugly. The warm glow of the flames pushed back the encroaching darkness, creating a small island of light in the growing gloom. Molly lay at my feet, her head on her paws but her body tense and alert. I checked my watch. It was time to lock up the chickens. With a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the coop, Molly padding along silently beside me. The coop was situated at the edge of the cleared area around our house, right where the manicured lawn gave way to the wild tangle of the forest. As we approached, I could hear the soft clucking of the hens settling in for the night. But there was something else too, a sound I couldn't quite place. It was faint, barely audible over the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. A sort of clicking, tapping, like the ticking of a clock, but irregular and somehow organic. I paused, straining my ears to catch the sound again. Beside me, Molly went rigid, her hackles rising as she stared intently into the darkness beyond the coop. A chill ran down my spine despite the lingering heat of the day. Something was out there watching us from the shadows. And as I stood there, frozen in place with my hand on the coop's latch, I couldn't shake the terrifying certainty that whatever it wasn't anything I had ever encountered in these woods before. With trembling hands, I fumbled with the latch on the chicken coop, my eyes darting between the task at hand and the impenetrable darkness of the forest edge. The clicking sound had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was somehow even more unsettling. It was as if the entire woods were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Molly's low growl broke the eerie quiet. She was staring intently at a specific spot in the tree line, her body coiled like a spring ready to unleash. I followed her gaze, squinting into the gloom, but could see nothing beyond the first few feet of underbrush. "It's nothing, girl," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as her. "Probably just a raccoon or something." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Whatever was out there, it was no raccoon. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. I quickly finished securing the coop and turned to head back to my campsite. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a sound that didn't belong in this world. My blood ran cold. Molly's growl turned into a series of sharp, angry barks, and then from the corner of my eye I saw movement. It emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given form. At first all I could make out was its sheer size. It towered over me, standing at least 8 feet tall. As it stepped into the faint light cast by my flashlight, I felt my sanity begin to unravel. The creature before me defied description. Its body was emaciated, little more than skin stretched taut over protruding bones. But it was the skin itself that turned my stomach. It hung in rotting tatters as if the creature was decaying while still alive. Matted fur, caked with what looked horribly like dried blood, covered patches of its body. Its head was the most terrifying part. Atop its elongated skull sat a massive rack of antlers like those of a monstrous deer. But its face, yellow eyes glowing with an unholy light, were set deep in cavernous sockets. Its mouth, filled with rows of jagged teeth, hung open in a silent scream. The stench hit me then. A nauseating mix of rotting meat and sulfur that made my eyes water and my gorge rise. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear more profound than anything I had ever experienced. Molly, brave, foolish Molly, launched herself at the creature with a furious snarl. For a moment I feared for her life, certain that this monstrous being would tear her apart. But to my amazement, the creature recoiled, taking an awkward, jerky step backward. That movement broke the spell of terror that had gripped me. In that instant, survival instinct took over. I turned and ran, my legs pumping furiously as I sprinted towards the house. I could hear Molly's paws pounding the earth behind me, and beyond that, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, the click-tap moan of the creature giving chase. I burst through the back door, slamming it shut behind me just as Molly darted inside. My grandmother stood in the kitchen, her face a mask of concern. "What on earth?" she began, but the words died on her lips as she took in my terror-stricken face and Molly's agitated state. I opened my mouth to explain, to warn her about the horror that lurked just outside our door, but no words came out. How could I describe what I had seen? How could I make her understand the impossibility, the wrongness of the creature in the woods? As I stood there gasping for breath and trembling from head to toe, I realized that my life had irrevocably changed. The woods I had once loved, once considered a second home, had revealed a dark secret, and I had a sickening feeling that this was only the beginning. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every whisper of wind through the trees outside sent my heart racing. I huddled in my bed, covers pulled up to my chin, with Molly pressed close against my side. Her warmth and steady breathing were the only things keeping me from completely unraveling. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through my curtains, I finally drifted into a fitful doze. But even in sleep, I found no respite. My dreams were filled with grotesque images, rotting antlers, glowing eyes, and always that terrible clicking sound. I awoke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. For a moment, I clung to the desperate hope that the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. But the haunted look in Molly's eyes as she gazed up at me quickly dispelled that comforting illusion. With leaden limbs, I dragged myself out of bed and made my way downstairs. The house was quiet, save for the soft murmur of the TV in my grandfather's room. I found my grandmother in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, worry etched deep in the lines of her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said softly as I slumped into a chair across from her. I opened my mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Where could I even begin? How could I explain what I had witnessed without sounding completely insane? I saw something in the woods last night. I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Something not natural. My grandmother's brow furrowed, but she remained silent, waiting for me to continue. It was huge, Grandma. Taller than any man I've ever seen. And it had antlers like a deer, but wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The words tumbled out of me now, a torrent of fear and confusion. Its skin was rotting off its body. And the smell. Oh God, the smell. I expected disbelief, maybe even laughter. What I didn't expect was the look of grim understanding that settled over my grandmother's features. Your grandfather always said there were things in these woods that defied explanation, she said softly, her eyes distant. Things that shouldn't exist but do. A chill ran down my spine. You believe me? She reached across the table and took my hand in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. I've lived in these parts for over 60 years, child. I've seen things that would turn your hair white. What you saw last night? It's not the first time something like that has been spotted in these woods. My mind reeled. All this time I had thought I knew these woods inside and out. But now I was realizing that I had only scratched the surface of their secrets. What? What was it? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. My grandmother shook her head slowly. There are some who call them skinwalkers. Others have different names. But names don't matter much when you're face to face with something like that. She stood up abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the backyard and the forest beyond. Your grandfather and we've protected this land for decades. Kept the things at bay, but with him bedridden now. She trailed off, her shoulders sagging slightly. I felt a weight settle in the pit of my stomach. The creature I had seen wasn't just some random monster. It was part of something larger, something that had been going on long before I was born. What do we do? I asked, my voice small and frightened. My grandmother turned back to me, her eyes hard with determination. We do what we've always done. We protect our own, and we stay vigilant. As I nodded, trying to absorb this new reality, a thought struck me. The chickens! I exclaimed, jumping to my feet. In the chaos of the previous night, I had completely forgotten about them. Without waiting for a response, I bolted for the back door, Molly hot on my heels. As I burst out into the morning sunlight, I half expected to see the coop in ruins, feathers and blood everywhere. But to my amazement, it stood untouched, the chickens inside clucking contentedly. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I approached the coop, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There in the soft earth around the structure was a single massive footprint. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, elongated and misshapen, with what looked like razor-sharp claws at the end of each toe. The creature had been here, mere feet from our sleeping chickens. And suddenly I understood with terrifying clarity that this was far from over. Whatever that thing was, whatever dark forces were at work in these woods, they weren't done with us yet. As I stood there, staring at that impossible footprint, I felt a change come over me. The paralyzing fear of the previous night was still there, but alongside it grew something else, a fierce determination. This was my home, my family's land, and come hell or high water, I was going to defend it. In the days that followed, I threw myself into research with a fervor that bordered on obsession. My grandmother's words about skinwalkers had given me a starting point, and I was determined to learn everything I could about these creatures and any other supernatural entities that might be lurking in our woods. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, scouring every corner of the internet for information. What I found both fascinated and terrified me. Skinwalkers, it turned out, were deeply rooted in Native American lore, particularly among the Navajo. They were said to be evil witches or shamans who could transform into animals or other people. But the more I read, the more I realized that what I had seen didn't quite fit the traditional skinwalker description. The creature in our woods seemed to be something different, something older perhaps, something that defied easy categorization. I branched out, delving into cryptozoology forums, paranormal investigation sites, and even academic journals on folklore and mythology. I read about Wendigos, Leshy, and other forest-dwelling entities from various cultures. Each account sent shivers down my spine, but none fully matched what I had witnessed. As I dug deeper, I started to notice a pattern. There were reports, scattered across decades and continents, of encounters with beings that shared similarities with my creature. Emaciated bodies, antlers, the smell of decay. These details cropped up again and again in stories from remote, heavily forested areas. One account in particular caught my attention. It was from a logger in the Pacific Northwest, dated nearly 50 years ago. He described an encounter with a rotting deer man that had stalked his camp for several nights. The details were chillingly similar to what I had experienced, right down to the clicking sound. But it was the logger's description of the aftermath that truly unsettled me. He wrote about a growing sense of wrongness in the forest, as if the creature's presence had somehow tainted the land itself. Plants withered, animals fled, and an oppressive atmosphere settled over the area. As I read his account, I couldn't help but glance out my window at the woods beyond. Had they always looked so menacing? The trees seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. And was it my imagination, or did the birdsong sound more subdued than usual? I shook my head, trying to clear away these paranoid thoughts. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter with the creature was just the beginning of something much larger and more sinister. My grandmother noticed my growing obsession. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts and hastily scribbled notes, she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You need to be careful," she said, her voice low and serious. "Knowledge is power, but it can also be dangerous. The more you learn about these things, the more you open yourself up to their influence." I looked up at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She sighed, sinking into the chair beside me. "There's a reason your grandfather and I never told you much about the oddities in these woods. The less attention you pay to them, the less power they have over you. But how can we protect ourselves if we don't understand what we're up against?" I argued. My grandmother's eyes hardened. "Sometimes understanding is not as important as action. Your grandfather didn't need to know the name or origin of every creature to keep them at bay. He just needed to know how to protect our land." Her words gave me pause. I had been so focused on identifying and categorizing the creature that I hadn't given much thought to practical defense. "So what did Grandpa do?" I asked. A sad smile flickered across her face. "That's a conversation for another time. For now, I think you need to step away from all this." She gestured at my research materials. "And get some fresh air. Why don't you take Molly for a walk? Just stay close to the house." I wanted to protest, to dive back into my research, but I could see the worry in her eyes. With a reluctant nod, I stood up and called for Molly. Maybe some time outside would help clear my head. As we stepped out onto the porch, the cool evening air hit my face, and I took a deep breath. The forest stretched out before us, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. For a moment, it looked just like it always had, familiar, almost comforting. But then I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the clicking sound. Molly heard it too. Her ears perked up and a low growl rumbled in her chest. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding us. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The forest fell silent, save for the pounding of my own heart. I backed slowly into the house, pulling Molly with me, and slammed the door shut. As I leaned against it, trembling, I realized that my grandmother had been right. No amount of research could have prepared me for the sheer primal terror of that moment. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some creature to be studied and catalogued. It was a malevolent presence, aware and intelligent, and it was watching us. As I sank to the floor, Molly pressing close to offer comfort, I knew that our quiet life in these woods had come to an end. A battle was coming, whether we were ready for it or not. The days that followed were a blur of activity. My grandmother, seeing the fear in my eyes after that evening on the porch, finally relented and began to share some of the knowledge she and my grandfather had accumulated over the years. "Your grandfather was a practical man," she explained as we sat at the kitchen table. A collection of old journals and handwritten notes spread out before us. He didn't care much for fancy explanations or ancient legends. He just wanted to know how to keep our family safe. I leafed through one of the journals, marveling at my grandfather's neat, precise handwriting. The pages were filled with detailed observations of the woods, strange occurrences, and most importantly, methods of protection. "Salt lines," my grandmother said, pointing to a particular entry. "Your grandfather swore by them, said nothing unnatural could cross a line of pure salt." I nodded, remembering the rows of large salt containers in our pantry that I'd always assumed were for canning or preserving food. Now they took on a whole new significance. What else? I asked eagerly. She pulled out another journal. Iron, cold iron specifically. He'd hang iron charms on trees at the edge of our property, said it helped keep the worst things at bay. As we pored over the journals, a plan began to take shape. We would fortify the house and the immediate area around it, creating a safe zone. Salt lines, iron charms, protective symbols. We would use every trick my grandfather had documented. But it wasn't just about defense. My grandmother stressed the importance of maintaining a connection with the land itself. This land has been in our family for generations, she said, her eyes distant with memory. We're its caretakers, not just its owners. Your grandfather understood that. He respected the forest even as he protected us from its dangers. She taught me old rituals, not flashy magic, but simple acts of reverence. Leaving offerings of cornmeal at the base of the oldest trees, whispering thanks to the land before harvesting anything from it. Small gestures that she assured me made a big difference. The forest knows its friends, she said. Treat it with respect and it will help protect you from the darker things that dwell within it. As we worked to secure our home, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Fear, certainly. The memory of that creature was still fresh in my mind, but also a growing sense of purpose. This was my heritage, my responsibility. I was no longer just a kid who liked camping in the woods. I was a defender of this land, following in my grandfather's footsteps. We started close to the house, laying down salt lines and hanging iron charms. I helped my grandmother draw protective symbols over the doors and windows. Simple, geometric designs that she said had been passed down through her family for generations. As we worked our way outward, towards the edge of the cleared area around our home, I felt a palpable change in the atmosphere. The oppressive feeling that had settled over the woods seemed to recede slightly. The birds sang a little louder, the breeze felt a little fresher. But as we approached the tree line, that feeling of wrongness returned. The shadows seemed deeper here, the silence more pronounced. As I hammered an iron charm into one of the boundary trees, I could have sworn I heard that familiar clicking sound, just at the edge of hearing. I froze, my hammer poised mid-swing. Grandma, I whispered, did you hear that? She nodded grimly, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. It's watching us, testing our defenses. A chill ran down my spine. The idea that the creature, or whatever force it represented, was intelligent enough to recognize what we were doing was terrifying. But my grandmother's calm determination bolstered my courage. Let it watch, she said, her voice hard. Let it see that we're not easy prey, that we know how to protect what's ours. As if in response to her words, a low moan echoed through the trees, setting the hairs on the back of my neck on end. But this time, instead of freezing in terror, I felt a spark of defiance ignite in my chest. I turned back to the tree, driving the iron charm home with renewed vigor. Each strike of the hammer felt like a declaration. This is our land. You are not welcome here. As we finished our work and headed back to the house, I glanced over my shoulder at the dark wall of trees. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a flash of antlers in the gloom, but then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had been real or just a trick of the fading light. One thing was certain, the battle for our home had begun, and I was determined to be ready for whatever came next. Weeks passed and life settled into a new tense rhythm. Our protective measures seemed to be working. The oppressive atmosphere that had settled over our land had lifted somewhat, and we hadn't had any direct encounters with the creature since that night by the chicken coop. But we couldn't let our guard down. Every evening I would walk the perimeter of our property with Molly, checking the salt lines and iron charms. My grandmother had taught me to listen to the forest, to feel the subtle shifts in its energy, and though things were calmer, there was still an undercurrent of wrongness, a sense that something was waiting, biding its time. It was on one of these evening patrols that everything changed. The day had been unusually hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of a storm. As Molly and I made our rounds, the sky darkened ominously, distant thunder rumbling like the growl of some great beast. We were at the far edge of our property, where the maintained lawn gave way to wild undergrowth, when Molly suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. Her hackles rose and a low, menacing growl rumbled in her chest. I froze, my hand instinctively tightening on the iron rod I carried for protection. The woods ahead were still, too still. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive, waiting silence. And then I heard it. That familiar, terrifying click-tap sound. But this time it wasn't coming from a single direction. It seemed to surround us, echoing from every shadow. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned in a circle, trying to locate the source of the sound. That's when I saw them. Yellow eyes gleaming in the gathering darkness. Not just one pair, but many. They blinked in and out of existence, appearing between trees, behind bushes, always just at the edge of visibility. I took a step back, my mouth dry with fear. This wasn't just our creature. There were more of them. Many more. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the woods for a brief, terrifying moment. In that flash of brightness, I saw them clearly for the first time. Twisted, emaciated forms with antlers jutting from misshapen skulls, rotting flesh hanging from protruding bones, mouths filled with far too many teeth opened in silent screams. The thunder that followed snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, Molly at my heels, sprinting for the safety of our house. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of pursuit, the crack of breaking branches, the thud of heavy footfalls, and always that terrible clicking noise. We burst out of the tree line into the cleared area around our house. I could see my grandmother on the porch, her face a mask of concern. She must have sensed something was wrong. "Get inside," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. But as we crossed the yard, I realized with dawning horror that we weren't going to make it. The creatures were too fast, too close. I could feel their rancid breath on the back of my neck, hear the snap of their jaws just inches behind me. In that moment of desperation, something inside me shifted. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a sudden fierce determination. This was my home, my family's land. I would not let these abominations desecrate it. I skidded to a stop and spun around, raising the iron rod like a weapon. "You are not welcome here," I shouted, my voice ringing with an authority I didn't know I possessed. To my amazement, the creatures hesitated. They hovered at the edge of the salt line we had laid down, hissing and clicking in what sounded almost like frustration. My grandmother's voice rang out from behind me, strong and clear. She was chanting something in a language I didn't recognize, her words seeming to vibrate in the air around us. The effect on the creatures was immediate. They recoiled as if struck, their unearthly shrieks piercing the night. The largest of them, the one I recognized from my first encounter, fixed its glowing eyes on me. In that gaze I saw hatred, hunger, and something else, a grudging respect. For a long moment, we stood there in a tense standoff, my grandmother chanting, Molly growling at my side, and me with my iron rod raised, facing down a horde of nightmare creatures. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. One moment they were there, a wall of twisted flesh and antlers, and the next, they had melted back into the shadows of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there panting, my arms trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. Slowly I lowered the iron rod, hardly daring to believe it was over. My grandmother's hand on my shoulder made me jump. I turned to find her looking at me with a mixture of pride and concern. "You did well," she said softly. "But this isn't over. They'll be back." I nodded, knowing in my heart that she was right. We had won this battle, but the war for our land, for our very way of life, was far from over. As we made our way back to the house, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain poured down in sheets, washing away the stench of the creatures and the fear sweat that coated my skin. I paused on the porch, looking back at the dark wall of trees. Lightning flashed again, and for just a moment I thought I saw a pair of yellow eyes watching from the shadows. But then they were gone, leaving me to wonder if they had ever been there at all. One thing was certain. Our quiet life in these woods had changed forever. We were guardians now, protectors of this land against forces most people couldn't even imagine. And as I stepped into the warm light of our home, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. In the months that followed our confrontation with the creatures, life settled into a new routine. The immediate threat had passed, but we knew it wasn't gone for good. The creatures, or whatever dark force they represented, were still out there waiting. My grandmother and I fell into a pattern of constant vigilance. Every morning we would check and reinforce our protective measures. Salt lines were refreshed, iron charms inspected and replaced if necessary. We learned to read the subtle signs in nature that warned of the creature's presence. A sudden hush in the forest, an unexplained chill in the air, the way Molly's ears would perk up at some sound only she could hear. My grandfather, though still bedridden, became an active participant in our efforts. His mind was as sharp as ever, and he would pore over his old journals searching for any information that might help us. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear him and my grandmother talking in low, urgent voices, discussing strategies and sharing old stories I was sure they had never intended for me to hear. As for me, I found myself changing in ways I never expected. The carefree teenager who had loved nothing more than camping under the stars was gone. In his place was someone more cautious, more aware of the hidden dangers that lurked in the shadows, but also someone stronger, more confident in my ability to face those dangers. I threw myself into learning everything I could about protecting our land. My grandmother taught me old rituals and charms, while my online research continued, now focused more on practical defense than mere identification of threats. I learned to make protective amulets, to recognize and draw symbols of warding, even to brew simple herbal mixtures that my grandmother swore would keep the darkness at bay. But it wasn't all grim determination and constant fear. There were moments of lightness, too. Moments that reminded me why this land was worth protecting. Like the crisp autumn morning when I went out to check the chicken coop and found a family of foxes playing in the yard. They froze when they saw me but didn't run. Instead, the mother fox met my gaze with an almost human intelligence before leading her kits back into the woods. It was a moment of pure, wild beauty that took my breath away. Or the winter evening when a heavy snow blanketed everything in white, transforming our woods into a glittering wonderland. As I stood on the porch, marveling at the beauty, I felt a deep connection to the land, a sense of belonging that went beyond mere ownership. Spring brought new challenges as the forest came back to life. The increased activity made it harder to distinguish between natural sounds and potential threats, but it also brought a renewed sense of hope. As I watched the first green shoots push through the soil, I was reminded of the resilience of nature, of life's stubborn insistence on continuing even in the face of darkness. Through it all, Molly remained my constant companion. Her keen senses often alerted us to potential threats before we noticed anything amiss. She seemed to have taken on the role of guardian with a seriousness that belied her playful nature. Even on quiet days, she would patrol the property boundaries, her ears alert and her eyes scanning the tree line. As summer approached once again, bringing with it the anniversary of our first encounter with the creatures, tension began to mount. Would they return? Had our defenses truly kept them at bay? Or had they simply been biding their time, waiting for us to let our guard down? It was on a sweltering afternoon in late June that we got our answer. I was in the garden with my grandmother, harvesting early vegetables, when Molly suddenly went rigid, her hackles rising as she stared intently at the woods. We froze, listening. At first, all I could hear was the buzz of insects and the distant call of a hawk. But then, carried on a warm breeze, came that all-too-familiar sound. Click, tap, moan. My grandmother and I exchanged a look of grim understanding. They were back. We hurried inside, securing doors and windows, checking our protective charms. I could feel the change in the air, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. As night fell, the sounds grew closer, clicking and tapping, punctuated by low, guttural moans that sent shivers down my spine. But this time, we were prepared. My grandmother began a low chant, words of power passed down through generations. I stood by the window, iron rod in hand, watching the tree line. Molly paced restlessly, growling low in her throat. Then in the gathering gloom, I saw them. Yellow eyes gleamed between the trees, more numerous than before. Twisted, antlered shapes moved in the shadows, testing the boundaries of our defenses. But something was different this time. The creatures seemed hesitant. They approached the edge of our property but didn't attempt to cross. It was as if they were probing, searching for weaknesses but unwilling or unable to launch a full assault. Hours passed in tense vigilance. The creatures circled our property, their eerie calls echoing through the night. But they never breached our defenses, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. They melted back into the depths of the forest, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease. In the days that followed, we remained on high alert, but no further incursions came. It seemed that our preparations, our unwavering stance, had made an impression. We had proven ourselves not to be easy prey, but formidable adversaries in our own right. As summer wore on, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the woods lifted, replaced by the usual sounds and rhythms of the forest. But we never forgot, never let our guard down completely. One evening, as I sat on the porch with my grandfather, who had finally regained enough strength to leave his bed for short periods, he turned to me with a proud smile. "You've done well," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've become a true guardian of this land." I felt a warmth bloom in my chest at his words. "I had good teachers," I replied, thinking of all the knowledge and strength both he and my grandmother had passed on to me. He nodded, his gaze turning to the peaceful woods before us. "This land, it's more than just property. It's a responsibility, a sacred trust. We protect it, and in turn it protects us. Never forget that." As I looked out at the forest, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, I felt a profound sense of connection. This was my home, my heritage. The creatures in the woods were a part of that heritage too, in their own twisted way. They were a reminder of the wild, unknowable aspects of nature, the dangers that lurked in the shadows. But we had faced those dangers. We had stood our ground, protected what was ours, and in doing so, we had grown stronger, more deeply rooted in this land we called home. I knew the creatures might return one day. The battle might never truly be over, but as I sat there with my grandfather listening to the evening chorus of birds and insects, feeling the gentle breeze on my face, I wasn't afraid. This was our land. Our home, and whatever came, whatever darkness tried to encroach upon it, we would be ready. We were its guardians, its protectors, and we would never ever back down. As night fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, I heard a distant sound from the depths of the forest. For a moment my heart raced, thinking it was the creatures returning, but then I recognized it, the haunting call of a great horned owl, a sound I hadn't heard since before our first encounter with the creatures. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. The forest was healing, returning to its natural rhythms, and we were a part of that healing, guardians not just against the darkness but for the light and life of these woods we called home. The battle might not be over, but for now, in this moment, all was well. And that was enough. The moving truck's engine groaned as it crawled up the dusty dirt road, each turn of the wheels kicking up a cloud of fine desert sand. I sat behind the wheel, my knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. The barren landscape stretched out before me, an endless sea of scrub brush and sun-bleached rocks. "Almost there," I muttered to myself, though the words brought little comfort. Our new home appeared on the horizon, a weathered single-story ranch house that seemed to blend into the desolate surroundings. The realtor had called it rustic charm. Now seeing it in person, I couldn't help but think abandoned might have been a more fitting description. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, a sense of unease settled over me. The house stood silent, its windows dark and uninviting. The nearest neighbor was miles away, hidden behind rolling hills of sand and cacti. Isolation had never bothered me before, but something about this place felt different, wrong. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves and exhaustion from the long drive. This was our fresh start, a chance to leave the past behind and build something new. I couldn't let baseless anxiety ruin it before we'd even unpacked. Stepping out of the truck, the desert heat hit me like a physical force. The air was thick and still, carrying the acrid scent of creosote and sun-baked earth. As I moved to the back of the truck to start unloading, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, scanning the horizon, but saw nothing but shimmering heat waves rising from the ground. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My gaze lingered on a distant cluster of rocks, their shadows seeming to shift and elongate in ways that defied the sun's position. Just a mirage, I told myself. But the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. With a deep breath, I threw myself into the task of unloading, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I finally finished bringing the last of our belongings inside. Exhausted, I collapsed onto a makeshift bed of blankets in what would become the living room. The house creaked and settled around me, unfamiliar sounds in an unfamiliar place. As I drifted off to sleep, my last conscious thought was a silent prayer that things would feel better in the morning. I had no idea then how wrong I would be. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to permeate the house, focusing instead on the practical tasks of making our new home livable. But as the initial busyness faded, I found it harder to dismiss the strange occurrences that began to pile up. It started small. Items would go missing only to turn up in places I was certain I hadn't left them. At first I blamed it on the chaos of moving, on my own forgetfulness, but as it happened more frequently, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the sounds. In the dead of night, when the desert fell silent save for the occasional cry of a coyote, I would hear it, a faint scratching like nails on wood coming from just outside my bedroom window. Each time I gathered the courage to look, I saw nothing but the empty expanse of our yard, bathed in moonlight. One morning, about a week after we'd moved in, I stepped outside to find strange tracks in the dirt near the house. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, not quite animal, not quite human. The prints were elongated and distorted, as if whatever had made them was walking on the sides of misshapen feet. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. But deep down I knew that no local wildlife could have left marks like these. As I followed the trail with my eyes, I noticed it led directly to my bedroom window, where the sand was disturbed as if something had stood there for a long time, watching. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I rushed back inside, my heart pounding, and spent the rest of the day obsessively checking and rechecking the locks on every door and window. That night, as I lay in bed trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything, I heard it again. The scratching, louder this time, more insistent, and beneath it, a low, guttural sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I wanted to scream, to run, to call for help. But fear had paralyzed me, leaving me frozen in my bed as the sounds continued just outside, separated from me by nothing more than a thin pane of glass. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the noises finally ceased. I lay there shaking until the sun was fully up. When I finally found the courage to look outside, I found deep gouges in the wooden frame of my window, proof that what I'd heard wasn't just a product of my imagination. Something had been there trying to get in, and somehow I knew with chilling certainty that it would be back. As the days wore on, the incidents became more frequent and more difficult to ignore. The scratching at my window was a nightly occurrence now, sometimes accompanied by heavy breathing or low animalistic growls. I took to sleeping in the living room as far from the windows as possible, but it didn't help. The sounds followed me as if whatever was out there knew exactly where I was at all times. During the day, I threw myself into researching local wildlife, desperate to find some explanation for what was happening, but nothing I found came close to matching the tracks I'd seen or the sounds I'd heard. The more I searched, the more I realized how little I knew about the area we'd moved to. I began to notice other things too. Small items would go missing from the yard. Gardening tools, a wind chime, even a small decorative statue. At first I thought it might be local kids playing pranks, but we were too isolated for that to be likely. And then I found one of the missing items, the wind chime, mangled and twisted almost beyond recognition, half buried in the sand at the edge of our property. The sight of it made my blood run cold. This wasn't the work of animals or mischievous teenagers. Whatever was doing this was intelligent, and it seemed to be sending me a message. One afternoon, as I was hanging laundry on the clothesline in the backyard, I felt the now familiar sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the horizon, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still among a cluster of cacti about 100 yards away. It was tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen, and its proportions were wrong. Its arms seemed too long, its legs bent at unnatural angles. I blinked, sure that I must be seeing things, but when I opened my eyes, it was still there. As I watched, frozen in terror, it took a single fluid step forward. The movement was like nothing I'd ever seen before, smooth yet utterly inhuman. I ran then, abandoning the laundry and fleeing into the house. I slammed the door behind me, engaging every lock, and then collapsed against it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. For hours, I sat there, too afraid to move, too afraid to look out the windows. As night fell, I heard it again, the scratching, the growling, but now accompanied by a new sound. A rhythmic tapping like knuckles on glass moving from window to window around the house. It was toying with me, letting me know that it could get in any time it wanted. That night, huddled in the bathtub with all the lights on and a kitchen knife clutched in my trembling hands, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, I knew I couldn't face it alone. At first light, I would leave, driving as far and as fast as I could to escape this desert nightmare. But as the sun began to rise, I realized with growing horror that escape might not be as simple as I'd hoped. The driveway, which I could see from the bathroom window, was empty. My car, my only means of escape, was gone. The realization that my car was missing sent me into a panic. I tore through the house, searching frantically for my keys, my phone, anything that might help me call for help or find a way out. But everything was gone. My cell phone, the landline, even the emergency radio I'd bought when we first moved in. As the full weight of my situation sank in, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I was trapped here, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no way to call for help. And something was out there, waiting. I spent the day in a frenzy of activity, boarding up windows, barricading doors, and gathering anything that could be used as a weapon. All the while I strained my ears for any sound of approach, jumping at every creak of the house settling or gust of wind outside. As night fell, the scratching began again, more insistent than ever. It moved from window to window, door to door, as if testing my defenses. I huddled in the center of the living room, surrounded by my makeshift weapons, my eyes darting from one boarded-up window to another. Then, suddenly, silence fell. The abrupt cessation of noise was almost more terrifying than the scratching had been. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, when a new sound broke the stillness, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the roof. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving across the ceiling above me. I bit back a scream, my whole body trembling as I tracked the sound of the thing moving overhead. It paused directly above me, and for a moment all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then with a deafening crash, a section of the ceiling caved in. Dust and debris rained down, and through the hole I caught a glimpse of something that defied description. A tangle of elongated limbs and dark, leathery skin. I didn't think, I just reacted. Grabbing the nearest weapon, a heavy flashlight, I swung it with all my might at the thing reaching through the hole. There was a sickening crunch of impact followed by an inhuman shriek of pain and rage. The limb withdrew, and I heard the sound of something large moving rapidly across the roof. Without pausing to think, I raced for the front door, tearing away the barricade I'd constructed. I knew it was dangerous to go outside, but staying in the house was no longer an option. As I burst out into the cool night air, I could hear the thing moving, circling around to the front of the house. I ran blindly into the desert, my lungs burning as I gasped for air, my bare feet bloodied by rocks and cacti spines. Behind me, I heard the sound of pursuit, not the running of an animal, but something else, something that moved in a way that nothing natural should. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting as much distance between myself and the house as possible. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in the sand behind a large boulder. As I lay there struggling to catch my breath, I realized with dawning horror that I had no idea which direction I'd come from. In the darkness, with no landmarks to guide me, I was hopelessly lost. And somewhere out there in the vast, empty desert, something was hunting me. I don't know how long I huddled behind that boulder, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear any sign of pursuit. The desert night was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the pounding of my heart and my ragged breathing. As the initial surge of adrenaline began to fade, the reality of my situation set in. I was alone in the desert in the middle of the night with no supplies, no sense of direction, and no idea how far I'd run from the house. and somewhere out there something was looking for me. I knew I couldn't stay where I was. With no water and no protection from the elements, remaining stationary would be a death sentence, but moving meant risking detection by whatever was hunting me. In the end, the decision was made for me. A sound cut through the night. A low, guttural call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was answered by another call, then another, each from a different direction. There was more than one of them. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, no longer caring about stealth. I ran, choosing a direction at random, my only thought to put distance between myself and those terrible sounds. The desert landscape was treacherous in the dark. I stumbled over rocks, crashed through scrub brush that tore at my skin, and more than once narrowly avoided falling into dry creek beds that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Behind me, I could hear them. The sound of their pursuit was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not the running of animals, but something else. Something that moved in a way that defied natural law. It was as if they were gliding over the ground, covering impossible distances with each stride. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but still they gained on me. In desperation, I veered towards a cluster of large boulders, hoping to find some place to hide, some defensible position. As I scrambled up the rocks, my hands bleeding from sharp edges and my breath coming in ragged gasps, I heard them approaching. I wedged myself into a narrow crevice between two boulders, making myself as small as possible. For a moment, all was silent. Then I heard it, the sound of something large moving over the rocks, its breathing heavy and rhythmic. It paused near my hiding place, and I could sense its presence just on the other side of the boulder. I held my breath, every muscle in my body rigid with fear. I could hear it sniffing, searching, and I knew that at any moment it might find me. Then, without warning, a piercing shriek split the night. It was answered by more cries coming from all around me. They had me surrounded. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I was trapped with no hope of escape. Whatever these things were, whatever they wanted, this was the end. But as I prepared myself for the worst, a new sound cut through the night, the distant rumble of an engine. Headlights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as they approached. The creatures' cries turned from triumphant to alarmed. I heard the sound of them retreating, moving away from the approaching vehicle with incredible speed. As the headlights drew nearer, illuminating my hiding place, I felt a surge of hope. Against all odds, someone had found me. But even as relief washed over me, a nagging doubt remained. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? And more importantly, were they here to help me, or were they somehow connected to the horrors I'd just escaped? As the vehicle came to a stop nearby, I held my breath, unsure whether to reveal myself or remain hidden. The choice, I realized, might mean the difference between rescue and an even worse fate than the one I'd just narrowly avoided. The sound of car doors opening and closing echoed through the night. Footsteps crunched on the rocky ground, drawing nearer to my hiding place. I pressed myself further into the crevice, torn between the desperate hope for rescue and the fear of revealing myself to potential enemies. "Hello?" A voice called out, tentative and tinged with concern. "Is anyone out here?" It was a woman's voice, and something about its tone, a mixture of fear and determination, resonated with me. Still, I hesitated, my recent experiences having taught me the hard way that nothing in this desert was as it seemed. The footsteps drew closer, and a beam of light swept over the rocks near my hiding spot. "Please," the voice called again. "If you're out here, we want to help. We know about the things. You're not alone." Those last words broke through my paralysis. The thought that someone else knew, that I wasn't crazy or imagining the horrors I'd experienced, was too much to resist. Slowly, cautiously, I emerged from my hiding place. Two figures stood a short distance away, their flashlights trained on me. One was a woman, probably in her early 40s, with a weathered face that spoke of long exposure to the desert sun. The other was a younger man, barely out of his teens by the look of him, with wide eyes that darted nervously around the landscape. "Oh, thank God," the woman breathed, lowering her flashlight slightly. "Are you hurt?" I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw from running and fear. I managed a small nod instead. "It's okay," she said, her voice soothing. "We're here to help. Well, let's just call me the librarian. This is the kid. We need to get you out of here before they come back." The mention of they sent a shiver down my spine. You know about them? I croaked. The librarian's face hardened. We do, and we know they'll be back. Come on, we need to move. As we hurried towards their vehicle, an old battered SUV that had seen better days, I couldn't help but ask, "How did you find me?" The kid spoke up for the first time, his voice quiet but intense. "We've been monitoring their hunting patterns. When we saw them converge on this area, we knew someone must have escaped." The librarian ushered me into the back seat, then climbed in beside me while the kid took the wheel. As we sped away from the rock formation, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. A tall, misshapen form silhouetted against the starlit sky. I shuddered and sank lower in my seat. "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The librarian sighed heavily. "We don't know, not really. They started appearing in this area a few years ago. At first it was just sightings, things people dismissed as tricks of the light or overactive imaginations, but then people started going missing." "The authorities?" I asked. The kid let out a bitter laugh. "They don't believe us. Or they don't want to believe. Either way, they're no help. So it's just you two?" The librarian nodded. "We're part of a larger group. We call ourselves the Watchers. We do what we can to monitor their activities, warn people, and sometimes..." She trailed off, glancing at me. "Sometimes we're lucky enough to save someone." As we drove through the night, the librarian and the kid filled me in on what they knew. The creatures, they refused to give them a name, seemed to be nocturnal, retreating to unknown lairs during the day. They were incredibly fast, strong, and seemed to possess an intelligence that made them all the more terrifying. "But why?" I asked. "Why are they doing this?" The librarian shook her head. "We don't know. Hunting? Sport? Some purpose we can't even begin to understand. All we know is that they're getting bolder, ranging further from their usual territory." As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, we pulled up to a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of a tiny desert town I'd never heard of. "Welcome to Sanctuary," the kid said, a hint of pride in his voice. "It's not much, but it's safe. They can't come here during the day, and we've got defenses for the night." As I stepped out of the car, exhaustion hit me like a physical force. The events of the night caught up with me all at once, and I swayed on my feet. The librarian caught my arm, steadying me. "Let's get you inside. You need rest. But first..." She paused, her expression serious. "You need to make a choice. We can help you get back to your old life if that's what you want. Or you can stay, join us. Help us fight back." I looked at the building before me, then back at the desert we'd just escaped from. I thought about the horrors I'd witnessed, the narrow escape I'd had. And I thought about all the other people out there, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. In that moment, I knew there was only one choice I could make. "I'll stay," I said, my voice hoarse but determined. "I can't go back to my old life knowing what's out there. I want to help." The librarian nodded, a mix of approval and sadness in her eyes. "It won't be easy," she warned. "Once you're in this fight, there's no going back." "I understand," I replied, thinking of the horrors I'd witnessed and the narrow escape I'd had. "But I can't just walk away." The kid clapped me on the shoulder, a grim smile on his face. "Welcome to the Watchers," he said. Inside, Sanctuary was a hive of activity despite the early hour. A dozen or so people bustled about, some poring over maps spread across tables, others maintaining what looked like homemade surveillance equipment. They all paused briefly as we entered, eyeing me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The librarian led me to a small room off to the side. "Get some rest," she said. "We'll talk more when you've had a chance to recover." I wanted to protest, to start helping immediately, but exhaustion won out. I collapsed onto the narrow cot and was asleep almost instantly. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through a small, high window. For a moment I didn't know where I was. Then the memories came flooding back. The chase, the rescue, my decision to stay and fight. I found clean clothes laid out for me, sturdy, practical garments suited for the desert environment. After changing and splashing some water on my face from a basin in the corner, I made my way back to the main room. The kid was there, hunched over a computer terminal. He looked up as I approached. "Sleep well?" he asked. I nodded. How long was I out? About 12 hours, he replied. You needed it. The librarian wants to see you when you're ready. She's in the strategy room. I followed his directions to a small, cluttered office. The librarian was there, surrounded by stacks of books, papers, and what looked like plaster casts of strange footprints. She looked up as I entered. Good, you're up, she said. How are you feeling? Better, I replied. Still processing everything, but I'm ready to help. What do you need me to do? She gestured for me to sit. First, we need to know everything you can tell us about your encounter. Every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. For the next few hours, I recounted my experience, starting from the day I moved into the desert house. The librarian listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking for clarification. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. Your account matches what we've heard from others, she said. But there are a few details that are new. The way they toyed with you, removing your means of escape, that suggests a level of planning we haven't seen before. What does it mean? I asked. She shook her head. I'm not sure yet, but it's concerning. They're evolving, becoming more strategic. She stood up, pacing the small room. We need to step up our efforts, and for that we're going to need your help. Anything, I said. Just tell me what to do. The librarian smiled, but it was a grim expression. We're planning an expedition, she said. Into their territory. We need to find out where they're coming from. Maybe even what they are. It's dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be our only chance to stop them before more people get hurt. I felt a chill run down my spine at the thought of voluntarily going back into that nightmare. But I also felt a surge of determination. When do we leave? I asked. Tomorrow night, she replied. We move under cover of darkness just like they do. It's our best chance of getting close without being detected. As I left the strategy room, my mind was reeling. In just a few days, my entire world had been turned upside down. And now, I was preparing to journey into the heart of the danger I'd so narrowly escaped. But as I looked around at the dedicated faces of the watchers, I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever horrors awaited us out there in the desert night, we would face them together. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. The watchers moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies, checking equipment, and reviewing plans. I tried to absorb as much information as I could, but the sheer volume of it was overwhelming. As dusk approached, a tense atmosphere settled over Sanctuary. The expedition team gathered in the main room for a final briefing. There were 6 of us, myself, the librarian, the kid, and 3 others I'd come to know as the mechanic, the doctor, and the tracker. The librarian stood before us, her face grave. We all know the risks, she said. Once we're out there, we'll be in their territory. We move fast, we move quiet, and above all, we stick together. Any sign of trouble, we abort and head back to the extraction point. Understood? We all nodded solemnly. As night fell, we piled into 2 rugged off-road vehicles. The mechanic and the doctor took one, while I rode with the librarian, the kid, and the tracker in the other. We set out into the desert, our headlights cutting through the darkness. For hours we drove in tense silence, following a route that the tracker had mapped out based on previous sightings and encounters. As we ventured deeper into their territory, I felt a growing sense of dread. Every shadow seemed to move, every rock formation looked like it might be hiding one of those creatures. Finally, we reached our destination, a series of deep canyons that the watchers believed might hide the creature's lair. We parked the vehicles in a hidden ravine and continued on foot. The desert night was eerily quiet as we made our way through the twisting canyons. The only sounds were our muffled footsteps and the occasional whisper of communication between team members. The tracker led the way, consulting a device that looked like a cross between a GPS and a Geiger counter. We had been walking for maybe an hour when the tracker suddenly held up a hand, signaling us to stop. He pointed to something on the canyon wall. As we drew closer, I saw what had caught his attention, a series of deep gouges in the rock face as if something with incredibly strong claws had climbed up. The librarian examined the marks closely. They're fresh, she whispered. We're on the right track. We pressed on, now even more alert. The canyon seemed to be getting deeper, the walls closing in around us. And then, without warning, the narrow passage opened up into a vast cavern. What we saw there stopped us in our tracks. The cavern floor was littered with bones, some animal, some disturbingly human-like. Strange markings covered the walls, symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly, and at the far end of the cavern, barely visible in the gloom, was an opening that seemed to lead even deeper underground. The kid's voice broke the stunned silence. "We found it," he breathed. "We actually found their lair." But before anyone could respond, a blood-curdling shriek echoed through the cavern. It was answered by more cries coming from all around us. "It's a trap," the librarian yelled. "Run!" We turned to flee, but dark shapes were already pouring into the cavern from the passage we'd entered through. We were surrounded, cut off from our escape route. As the creatures closed in, their misshapen forms becoming clearer in the dim light, I realized with growing horror that this might be the end. We had come seeking answers, but instead, we had walked right into their clutches. In that moment, as the creatures prepared to attack, I couldn't help but think of how far I'd come from my quiet life just a week ago. I had sought a new beginning in the desert, but I never could have imagined it would lead me here, to this nightmarish cavern, face to face with horrors beyond imagination. As the first creature lunged forward, its elongated limbs reaching for us, I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The real battle was just beginning, and the fate of not just our small group, but perhaps all of humanity, hung in the balance. The desert night echoed with our screams and the inhuman cries of our attackers as the darkness closed in around us. As the creatures closed in, time seemed to slow. The librarian's voice cut through the chaos. "The flares! Use the flares!" In our panic, we'd almost forgotten about our emergency equipment. With shaking hands, I pulled a flare from my pack and struck it. Brilliant red light exploded in the cavern, momentarily blinding me. The effect on the creatures was immediate and shocking. They recoiled, shrieking in pain, their elongated limbs flailing as they tried to shield themselves from the light. The kid and the tracker followed suit, igniting more flares and tossing them in a wide arc around us. "The opening," the doctor shouted, pointing to the passage we'd entered through. "It's clear!" We didn't need to be told twice. As one, we bolted for the exit, the mechanic pausing only to toss a final flare behind us, creating a barrier of light between us and our pursuers. We ran through the twisting canyons, our lungs burning and legs aching. Behind us, we could hear the creatures recovering, their angry cries echoing off the rock walls. But the flares had given us the head start we needed. As we emerged from the canyon into open desert, I saw the welcome sight of our vehicles, right where we'd left them. We piled in, engines roaring to life as the mechanic and the kid took the wheels. We sped across the desert, all of us tense, expecting at any moment to see those terrifying shapes appear in the rearview mirrors. But as the miles stretched on and the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, we slowly began to relax. We had made it. We had escaped. Back at Sanctuary, exhausted but alive, we gathered to debrief. Despite the terror of our narrow escape, there was a sense of excitement in the air. We had found their lair. We had seen firsthand their weakness to light. For the first time since this nightmare began, we had hope. The librarian spread out a map on the table. "We know where they're coming from now," she said, her voice filled with determination. "And we know how to hurt them. It's time to take the fight to them." Over the next few weeks, we planned and prepared. The mechanic worked tirelessly, developing powerful UV lights that could be mounted on our vehicles. The doctor analyzed samples we'd managed to collect from the cavern, searching for any biological weaknesses we could exploit. The tracker used our newfound knowledge to predict the creature's movements with increasing accuracy. As for me, I threw myself into training, learning everything I could about survival, combat, and our enigmatic enemy. The terror of that night in the cavern never fully left me, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose. We were no longer just survivors or watchers. We were becoming warriors. Finally, the day came for our counterattack. Our plan was daring, perhaps even reckless, but it was our best chance to end this threat once and for all. We would drive into the heart of their territory in broad daylight, when they were at their weakest, and seal their underground lair with explosives. As we set out, our convoy armed to the teeth with lights and weapons, I thought back to the day I arrived in this desert, seeking a new beginning. I had found one, just not in the way I expected. Whatever happened next, I knew that the lonely, frightened person I had been was gone. In their place stood someone stronger, someone ready to face the darkness and fight for a future free from fear. The desert stretched out before us, no longer a place of terror, but a battlefield where we would make our stand. As we drove towards our destiny, I felt a surge of hope. We had survived the night. Now it was time to bring the dawn. The convoy of vehicles thundered across the desert, kicking up clouds of dust in our wake. The sun beat down mercilessly, but for once we welcomed its harsh glare. It was our greatest ally in this fight. As we approached the canyon that led to the creature's lair, tension mounted. The librarian's voice crackled over our radios. "Remember the plan. We go in fast, set the charges, and get out. No heroics." We entered the canyon, our modified vehicles bathing the rock walls in intense UV light. If any of the creatures were around, they remained hidden, unable to withstand the artificial daylight we brought with us. When we reached the cavern entrance, we moved with practiced efficiency. The mechanic and the kid began setting up the explosives while the rest of us formed a protective perimeter, our UV spotlight scanning for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the tracker's voice cut through the eerie silence. Movement. 3 o'clock. We swung our lights in unison, catching a glimpse of a dark, elongated form retreating deeper into the cavern. More shapes followed, a whole group of the creatures fleeing from the light. "They're retreating further underground," the doctor observed. "This might work better than we hoped." With the charges set, we began our withdrawal. That's when things went sideways. A tremor shook the ground, causing loose rocks to rain down around us. One particularly large boulder crashed down, blocking our exit path. "We're cut off," the kid shouted, panic evident in his voice. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm us. We were trapped, with only minutes before the explosives detonated. But then something unexpected happened. From deep within the cavern came a sound, not the terrifying shrieks we'd come to associate with the creatures, but something almost plaintive, desperate. And then, emerging from the shadows, came one of the creatures, but instead of attacking, it gestured towards the blocked passage, then back to itself. The librarian was the first to understand. "It wants to help," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. I think it wants to escape too." In that moment, we realized that perhaps these creatures weren't the mindless monsters we'd believed them to be. They were trapped just as we were, caught in a cycle of fear and violence. Working together, humans and creature alike, we managed to clear the passage just in time. As we raced out of the canyon, the explosion rocked the ground behind us, sealing the underground lair forever. In the aftermath, as the dust settled, we made an astounding discovery. The creature that had helped us was not alone. Others emerged, blinking in the sunlight, no longer hostile but curious and seemingly relieved. The doctor's analysis revealed the truth. These beings were the result of long-forgotten experiments, trapped underground and warped by isolation and fear. With patience and understanding, we found ways to communicate, to coexist. In the months that followed, our little desert community transformed. What had once been a battleground became a place of healing and reconciliation. The creatures, no longer forced to hunt in the night, began to change, their form slowly returning to something more recognizably human. As for me, I found the new beginning I had sought when I first came to the desert, but it was so much more than I could have ever imagined. I had found purpose, friends who had become family, and a role in bridging two worlds. One evening, as I stood watching the sunset with the librarian, she turned to me with a smile. "You know," she said, "I think it's time we stopped calling ourselves the Watchers. That chapter of our story is over." I nodded, understanding. "So what do we call ourselves now?" She looked out over the desert where humans and former creatures were working together to build a new community. "How about the Unifiers?" As the last light faded from the sky, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The night was no longer something to fear. We had faced the darkness both within and without and emerged stronger for it. Whatever challenges the future held, we would face them together, in the light of a new dawn.